What ultimately disabled more soldiers in some sectors of the World War II was not gunfire, but temperature. Cold, when it drops far enough, becomes a systems failure. Of equipment, of planning, and of the human body itself. Steel fractures. Lubricants seize. And inside a soldier's boot, something quieter begins. Moisture accumulates, circulation slows, and tissue starts to die long before the pain fully registers. Frostbite was not simply an unfortunate side effect of winter warfare. It was a predictable outcome of poor adaptation. The common assumption is that survival in extreme cold depended primarily on better gear, thicker boots, heavier socks, more insulation. But the historical record shows something different. In multiple armies, across the Eastern Front and into the Nordic campaigns, soldiers with limited equipment sometimes outperformed better supplied forces. The difference was not always material. It was procedural. It came down to how they used what they had. Among the most effective of these adaptations was a deceptively simple method, the improvised bootliner system. It required no factory production, no specialized training, and no advanced materials. Yet it directly addressed the most dangerous variable in cold weather survival, moisture trapped against the skin. This was the quiet innovation that kept feet functional when temperatures made conventional boots fail. The problem was not just the cold, but what happened inside the boot. Cold injuries in wartime are often described in terms of exposure, but exposure alone does not explain the scale of frostbite cases seen during campaigns like the German advance into the Soviet Union in 1941. Temperatures did not just drop. They interacted with poor logistical preparation. German forces, expecting a short campaign, were issued standard leather boots that performed adequately in temperate climates but failed catastrophically in deep winter. The issue was not simply insufficient insulation, it was the accumulation of moisture inside the boot. Sweat from the foot, inevitable during marching, had nowhere to go. In freezing conditions, that moisture reduced insulation, conducted heat away from the skin, and eventually froze. A damp boot became a heat sink. Once circulation slowed, tissue damage followed. Soviet and Finnish forces faced the same temperatures, often with fewer resources. Yet their rates of cold injury, while still significant, revealed something important. Adaptation mattered more than equipment alone. They had learned, through experience and necessity, that managing moisture was more critical than adding bulk. Soldiers began to solve the problem with whatever materials they could find. Improvisation in war is often romanticized, but in this case it was methodical and grounded in observation. Soldiers noticed that dry feet lasted longer than insulated ones that became damp. They also recognized that air, when trapped and kept dry, provided effective insulation. The solution they developed was simple. Create a removable, replaceable layer inside the boot that could absorb moisture and preserve a pocket of insulating air. Materials varied depending on availability. Straw was common in rural areas. Paper, newspaper, packaging, even maps was widely used. Fabric scraps served the same purpose. The method itself was straightforward. A layer of dry material was placed between the sock and the boot, sometimes wrapped around the foot, sometimes lining the interior. As the soldier moved, the material absorbed moisture that would otherwise saturate the sock and inner boot lining. At intervals, the material could be removed and replaced, restoring the system's effectiveness. This was not a perfect solution. It required discipline, access to replacement materials, and an understanding of when to change liners before saturation occurred, but it addressed the core issue more effectively than simply adding thicker socks, which often worsened moisture retention. What made this method effective was not insulation alone, but, moisture control. From a modern perspective, the effectiveness of these improvised liners can really be explained through basic thermodynamics and physiology. The human foot produces moisture continuously, even in cold conditions. When that moisture accumulates, it increases thermal conductivity, allowing heat to escape more rapidly. At the same time, it softens the skin, making it more vulnerable to damage. By introducing an absorbent layer, soldiers created a buffer zone. Moisture was drawn away from the skin and distributed into the liner material. This preserved a relatively dry microclimate around the foot, maintaining insulation and reducing heat loss. Equally important was the ability to remove and replace the liner. Unlike the boot itself, which might remain damp for extended periods, the liner could be swapped out, dried, or discarded. This turned a static system into a dynamic one that could adapt to changing conditions over the course of a march or encampment. In effect, soldiers had developed a primitive but functional moisture management system decades before modern synthetic materials and engineered fabrics made the concept standard. Different armies arrived at similar solutions through different experiences. The convergence of this method across multiple forces is, honestly, one of its most telling aspects. Finnish troops, operating in some of the harshest winter conditions of the war, made extensive use of straw and other natural materials. Their experience in winter warfare prior to the conflict had already emphasized the importance of layered, breathable systems rather than heavy, moisture-trapping gear. Soviet soldiers, often operating with inconsistent supply lines, relied heavily on improvisation. Accounts from the Eastern Front describe widespread use of paper and cloth as boot liners, particularly during the early years of the war when equipment shortages were, pretty acute. German forces, initially unprepared for winter conditions, began to adopt similar practices out of necessity. Field manuals and after-action reports increasingly emphasize the importance of keeping feet dry, rotating socks, and using improvised materials to manage moisture when proper equipment was unavailable. These were not isolated incidents. They represent a pattern of adaptation that emerged independently across different armies facing the same environmental constraints. The cost of ignoring these lessons was measured in lost mobility, not just injury. Frostbite is often discussed as a medical condition, but in a military context it is more accurately understood as a loss of operational capability. A soldier who cannot walk is no longer effective, regardless of their training or equipment. During the winter of 1941-42, German forces suffered, hundreds of thousands of cold weather casualties. Many of these weren't actually fatal, but they still removed soldiers from the line for extended periods, strained medical resources, and, reduced overall combat effectiveness. Units that might have held positions or executed maneuvers were instead immobilized. By contrast, forces that managed to reduce the incidence of frostbite, whether through better equipment, improved procedures, or just simple improvisation, retained, a lot more mobility. In winter warfare, mobility is often the decisive factor. It really determines whether a unit can reposition, resupply, or withdraw. The improvised bootliner system didn't eliminate frostbite, but it did reduce its frequency enough to matter. And in war, marginal improvements often have disproportionate effects. Over time, these field adaptations influenced formal military doctrine. What begins as improvisation in the field often becomes standard practice if it proves effective. The lessons learned from winter warfare in the Second World War did not disappear with the end of the conflict. They were studied, documented, and incorporated into post-war military doctrine. Modern cold weather gear reflects many of the same principles that underpin the improvised liner system. The development of vapor barrier systems, used by both military forces and polar explorers, represents a more advanced application of the same idea. For those interested in survival outside of a military context, the relevance of this technique remains clear. Modern gear has improved significantly, but it is not infallible. Equipment can fail, become saturated, or be unavailable altogether. The ability to improvise a moisture management system using available materials is a skill that retains value. The broader lesson is that survival in extreme conditions depends less on having the best equipment and more on understanding the principles that govern its use. There is a tendency to focus on the large-scale elements of war, strategy, technology, leadership, while overlooking the smaller, more immediate factors that determine outcomes on the ground. The improvised bootliner system is one of those factors. Understanding these details matters because they ground history in reality. They show how outcomes are shaped not only by decisions made at the highest levels, but by the cumulative effect of small adaptations made by individuals in the field. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, where the focus is on what actually made a difference, consider subscribing to Hidden in History. And if you think more people should understand how these overlooked lessons still apply today, share this video.